Have you ever watched the movie Saw? If you're into horror movies, I would assume you at least know about it. But the movie popularized and spurred on an interesting genre of horror, torture horror. It actually has a more commonly given name, but it's usually used as a derogatory term for many movies, and I'm fairly sure YouTube would frown on me for saying it. Uh, it is what it is. Now, there were movies that came before it that fit neatly into this category, and it's argued if the first Saw even fits into this category at all, even though the later films absolutely do. But Saw became a worldwide phenomenon. The film had a small budget and mostly focused on two individuals trapped and chained up in this disgusting room and challenged to a game of life and death. Their challenge was to find a way to free themselves from their binding and kill the other person. I would at least classify this as a form of torture. What follows is a story of the characters recalling their life and what led them up to this point. The theme of the game put forward by their game master, Jigsaw, was that they had not appreciated their life and that this game was to inspire them to learn to appreciate the life they have and do whatever is necessary to save themselves or die. It was an interesting premise with gruesome consequences, and it captivated the world. It tapped into that morbid curiosity that we all have and delivered a flawed but overall somewhat positive message. Jigsaw says, "Count your blessings, or he will count them for you." Now, this video isn't about Saw or any of the other gratuitous movies that up the ante following or preceding it, but rather about a short story that I consider to be one of the early progenitors of the genre of torture horror, written by the father of American Gothic horror. Today, we are discussing The Twisted Darkness of The Pit and the Pendulum by Edgar Allan Poe. Hi, folks. You can call me Norman. Welcome in, as today we are discussing a literary classic from the American Gothic horror titan Edgar Allan Poe, who continues to inspire literature and movies even over 100, 150, 200 years, something like that later. I would say it's an oldie, but a goodie. Now, I'm not an English lit graduate, nor do I have the persistence to make a 5-hour video on a Cormac McCarthy novel. But I do have this book. And I used to scream the lyrics of Helena by My Chemical Romance in the passenger seat of my friend's 1996 Camaro.
What's the worst thing I could say?
Now, many of you, I'm sure, are familiar with Edgar Allan Poe from high school English, maybe reading The Raven or The Telltale Heart, but I would hazard a guess that many of you have probably never read The Pit and the Pendulum. Poe actually had a vast body of work that many have never seen, including things like satire. But it's his tales of mystery and the macabre that have persisted to the modern day. These stories would usually include hints of the supernatural, but The Pit and the Pendulum is oddly grounded in comparison to a lot of his works. There's no specters, no monsters, or no cosmic entity, just people. This, however, makes it no less disturbing or sinister. I could go on and on talking about Poe himself and his body of work. It really deserves a video in and of itself. Even just the mystery of his death, I could probably make an hour-long video about All right, so here's what we're going to do. I'm going to do a synopsis and read aloud some of the highlights of the story and explain a little bit as we go on. It does use uncommon language as it was written over 150 years ago, and give some of my interjections here and there. Then we'll talk a little bit about its initial release and some of the people and media it's inspired over the years. And then I'm going to try and give what I think is going to be an analysis of the work appropriate for its time. And then lastly, we'll talk about how it's connected with me personally in the modern era. Also, spoilers, I suppose the short story was published in 1843, but because of that, it's absolutely free to find published all over the internet. Um, and it's a pretty quick read. It is a short story, like a lot of Poe's works. Most of you could probably read it under 30 minutes or even less, maybe. You can most definitely read it a lot faster than you can watch this video, I'm sure. Also, I'm going to give a quick rabbit hole warning just in case, because there's some stuff I learned while I was doing a little bit of research for this video that kind of blew my mind a little bit. I'm going to do my absolute best to not drone on about it for half an hour or anything like that. But I will include timestamps in the video in case you do want to skip that or anything like that. So also, for those who are subscribed or maybe coming here from another video, if you stick around to the end, I have some words I'd like to share with you. But with that out of the way, let's delve into the twisted depths of the pit and the pendulum. I was sick, sick unto death with that long agony, and when they at length unbound me and I was permitted to sit, I felt that my senses were leaving me. The sentence, the dread sentence of death, was the last of distinct accentuation which reached my ears. After that, the sound of the inquisitorial voices seemed merged in one dreamy, indeterminate hum. It conveyed to my soul the idea of revolution, perhaps from its association in fancy with the burr of a mill wheel. This only for a brief period, for presently I heard no more. Yet, for a while, I saw, but with how terrible an exaggeration, I saw the lips of the black-robed judges. They appeared to me white, whiter than the sheet upon which I traced these words, and this even to grotesqueness thin with the intensity of their expression of firmness, of immovable resolution, of stern contempt of human torture. So, our story starts with our protagonist receiving a death sentence from the inquisitors of the Spanish Inquisition. For those of you unaware, the Spanish Inquisition was a group founded by the Catholic monarchs of Spain in the 1400s to reestablish Catholicism as the dominant religion of their empire. I'm going to pause myself from really delving into it too much now, but many people's understanding of what the Inquisition did was to torture and execute Jews, Muslims, pagans, and those associated with witchcraft. Scary sounding people, right? The picture Poe paints here is grim, and his description of their black robes juxtaposed with their white thin lips is bone-chilling as they deliver their death sentence. The narrator obviously agrees because they then lose all of their faculties and they start to zone out of their surroundings and everything becomes this haze of torment. I'm not sure if something like this has ever happened to any of you, but the moment that comes to mind for me personally is when I got the call that my grandfather had passed away. Time just seemed to stop. My blood was running hot, and I had this ringing in my ears. I remember working, and then the next thing I remember is being in another room with a coworker bringing me some tissues and some water. It's truly a bizarre feeling. Our narrator, though, after some time, he just passes out, or as the story puts it, he swooned. What follows is the narrator recounting this feeling of being carried deep down into this structure by tall figures as he kind of ponders and thinks about this idea of swooning. So far, I had not opened my eyes. I felt that I lay upon my back, unbound. I reached out my hand, and it fell heavily upon something damp and hard. There, I suffered it to remain for many minutes, while I strove to imagine where and what I could be. I longed, yet dared not to employ my vision. I dreaded the first glance at objects around me. It was not that I feared to look upon things horrible, but that I grew aghast lest there should be nothing to see. At length, with wild desperation at heart, I quickly unclosed my eyes. My worst thoughts, then, were confirmed. The blackness of eternal night encompassed me. I struggled for breath. The intensity of the darkness seemed to oppress and stifle me. The atmosphere was intolerably close. I still lay quietly and made effort to excise my reason. I brought to mind the inquisitorial proceedings and attempted from that point to deduce my real condition. The sentence had passed, and it appeared to me that a very long interval of time had since elapsed. Yet, not for a moment did I suppose myself actually dead. Such a supposition, notwithstanding what we read in fiction, is altogether inconsistent with real existence. But where and in what state was I? This passage is terrifying to me, or at least thinking about it if it were to happen to me. Our narrator is so scared they don't even want to look. And when they finally do, they can't even see anything because it's so dark. Then they have this moment where they have to try and reassure themselves that they aren't actually dead, but are left questioning, where they are. After thinking about where they are and how long it's been, the narrator finally gets this courage to kind of get up and explore their surroundings by fumbling around their cell. And when they finally find a wall, they decide that they want to know more, and they devise this plan to leave a scrap of their garments at a part in the wall on the floor, and then they start to kind of count their paces, feeling around the wall in complete darkness. They eventually fall due to exhaustion, and when they wake up, they fumble around and they find that their captors have left them food and water, which they drink before continuing their exploration of the cell. After they finally make it back around to their starting point, they are left with more questions than answers, unfortunately, as they can't really determine the shape of the room, as it kind of they describe it as having too many angles, and they're just really unsure. They then decide to walk quietly across the room instead of feeling for the wall, but this is where they fall, only to make a terrifying discovery. In the confusion attending my fall, I did not immediately apprehend a somewhat startling circumstance, which yet, in a few seconds afterwards, and while I still lay prostrate, arrested my attention. I was this, my chin rested upon the floor of the prison, but my lips and the upper portion of my head, although seemingly at a less elevation than the chin, touched nothing. At the same time, my forehead seemed bathed in a clammy vapor, and the peculiar smell of decayed fungus arose to my nostrils. I put forward my arm and shuddered to find that I had fallen at the very brink of a circular pit, whose extent, of course, I had no means of ascertaining at the moment. Groping about the masonry, just below the margin, I succeeded in dislodging a small fragment, and let it fall into the abyss. For many seconds, I hearkened to its reverberations as it dashed against the sides of the chasm in its descent. At length there was a sullen plunge into water, succeeded by loud echoes. At the same moment, there came a sound resembling the quick opening as rapid closing of a door overhead, while a faint gleam of light flashed suddenly through the gloom, and as suddenly faded away. I saw clearly the doom which had been prepared for me, and congratulated myself upon the timely accident by which I had escaped. Another step before my fall, and the world had seen me no more. So we finally find the pit in the pit and the pendulum. This is where the torture really kicks up a notch. Our narrator, first and foremost, has no light. And that in and of itself is terrifying if you have to deal with that for long bouts of time. But the fact that there is just this bottomless pit also present is just horrifying. As he notes, he was just one step away from falling into this abyss. Our narrator then decides that they just want to get as far away from this pit as possible, and they start to scramble back towards the safety of the wall, where they once again fall asleep. But when they wake, there's food and water again. But even before they're able to finish it, they again fall asleep, and the narrator suspects that it must have been drugged, which is probably true, because when they wake up, they find that the room has been illuminated. But what they find, however, is that they were mistaken about their surroundings, as instead of it being some irregular shape, it's just a square. But the walls appear to be made of iron and covered in fiends and skeletons. But that's not the only thing that's different. They are bound tightly to a board and unable to move except for one arm slightly, so that they can eat some food that's been left for them. Here's the funny little thing, though. They didn't give him any water, and what they left was overly salted. It seems a little funny, but you can imagine being in a cell for what could be days in total darkness with maybe one glass of water, and in that time they give you something to help the hunger, but it's only going to make the thirst even worse. Have you ever tried to eat 10 saltine crackers without a glass of water? It's pretty much impossible. Also, I don't recommend. Don't do that. Looking upward, I surveyed the ceiling of my prison. It was some 30 or 40 feet overhead and constructed much as the side walls. It was the painted figure of time as he is commonly represented, save that, in lieu of a scythe, he held what, at a casual glance, I suppose to be the pictured image of a huge pendulum such as we see on antique clocks. There was something, however, in the appearance of this machine which caused me to regard it more attentively. While I gazed directly upward at it, for its position was immediately over my own, I fancied that I saw it in motion. In an instant afterwards, the fancy was confirmed. Its sweep was brief, and of course slow. I watched it for some minutes, somewhat in fear, but more in wonder. Now we finally find the pendulum. What's disturbing, though, is it's wielded by what looks like Father Time, who is pretty much a companion to the personification of death. But instead of a scythe, he has this pendulum. What's scary about this, though, is that this pendulum, while paying homage to time and its unceasing march, has what appears to be a blade affixed to the bottom. Our narrator calls this monkish ingenuity. But even before noticing that the pendulum has this blade and is sweeping back and forth across the room, they notice something else. Rats have started to come from the pit. Complete darkness, giant pit, overly salted food, and now rats. Fun. What boots it to tell of the long, long hours of horror, more than mortal, during which I counted the rushing vibrations of the steel, inch by inch, line by line, with a descent only appreciable at intervals that seemed ages. Down and still down it came. Days passed, might have been that many days passed, ere it swept so closely over me as to fan me with its acrid breath. The odor of the sharp steel forced itself into my nostrils. I prayed. I wearied heaven with my prayer for its more speedy descent. I grew fanatically mad and struggled to force myself upwards against the sweep of the fearful scimitar, and then I fell suddenly calm, and lay smiling at the glittering death as a child at some rare bauble. Now, a lot of what's happened in our story so far has been torture enough, but this last bit sends our narrator spiraling. They are in this hopeless situation where they can see the means of their death coming for them, but it's slow and consistent descent, which they say could have been Dave's, drives them into every corner of emotion to where they begin to go mad and start to just smile up at this slowly sweeps back and forth across the room. The narrator then begins to think of hope, and while they ridicule themselves for entertaining the notion of having hope, they start to think a little bit more analytically. They begin to take note of the rats and their hunger, and what they do is they have their one free hand and they begin to rub the remnants of their overly salted food over their restraints. Interesting. At first, the ravenous animals were startled and terrified at the change, at the cessation of movement. They shrank alarmedly back. Many sought the well, but this was only for a moment. I had not counted in vain upon their voracity. Observing that I remained without motion, one or two of the boldest leaped upon the framework and smelt at the surcingle. This seemed the signal for the general rush. Forth from the well they hurried in fresh troops. They clung to the wood, they overran it, and leaped in hundreds upon my person. The measured movement of the pendulum disturbed them not at all. Avoiding its strokes, they busied themselves with the anointed bandage. They pressed, they swarmed upon me in ever-accumulation heaps. They writhed upon my throat, their cold lips sought my own. I was half stifled by their thronging pressure. Disgust, for which the world has no name, swelled my bosom, and chilled with heavy clamminess my heart. Yet 1 minute, and I felt that the struggle would be over. Plainly I perceived the loosening of the bandage. I knew that in more than one place it must already be severed. With a more than human resolution, I lay still. So they came up with this plan to use the hunger of the rats to sever their bindings. But the rats swarming over him in hundreds, crawling all over him. Ugh. You know, desperate times call for desperate measures, I suppose. But funny enough, it works, and not a minute too soon, as the pendulum makes its last couple of swipes that slice at them before they're able to get out of the way of this death trap in just the nick of time. They were free, but still in the clutches of the Inquisition. Then the eyes of the demonic figures on the walls, the iron walls surrounding the rooms, begin to glow, and the last and final trial of our narrator begins. Unreal. Even while I breathed, there came to my nostrils the breath of the vapor of heated iron. A suffocating odor pervaded the prison. A deeper glow settled each moment in the eyes that glared at my agonies. A richer tint of crimson diffused itself over the pictured horrors of blood. I panted. I gasped for breath. There could be no doubt of the design of my tormentors. Oh, most unrelenting, oh, most demoniac of men. I shrank from the glowing metal to the center of the cell. Amid the thought of the fiery destruction that impended, the idea of the coolness of the well came over my soul like a balm. I rushed to its deadly brink. I threw my straining vision below. The glare from the enkindled roof illumined its inmost recesses. Yet for a wild moment did my spirit refuse to comprehending the meaning of what I saw. At length it wrestles its way into my soul. It burned itself in upon my shuddering reason. Oh, for a voice to speak. Oh, horror. Oh, any horror but this. With a shriek, I rushed from the margin and buried my face in my hands, weeping bitterly. So our narrator has just been thrust from pan to the fire. In an almost literal sense. It's also interesting that it creates a bit of a dichotomy as he is presented with a choice of how he wants to die. The fire is hot, but the abyss is cool. But the abyss that's been there since the beginning still scares him to his core for that unknown that it represents. They aren't even given much time to think, however, as the walls of the cell begin to close in on them. Death, I said. Any death but that of the pit. Fool. Might I have not known that into the pit it was the object of the burning iron to urge me? Could I resist its glow? Or if even that, could I withstand its pressure? And now, flatter and flatter grew the lozenge, with a rapidity that left me no time for contemplation. Its center, and of course its greatest width, came just over the yawning gulf. I shrank back, but the closing walls pressed me resistlessly onward. At length, for my seared and writhing body, there was no longer an inch of foothold on the firm floor of the prison. I struggled no more, but the agony of my soul found vent in one loud, long, and final scream of despair. I felt that I tottered upon the brink. I averted my eyes. Past all hope and tenacity, avoiding the torture and death traps set by the Inquisition, our narrator has come to the brink of death, with no more hope, no more ideas, only the thoughts of which death he will face. Be crushed by the glowing hot walls coming towards him, or to fall into the pit. But then in his final moments, something happens. There was a discordant hum of voices. There was a loud blast as of many trumpets. There was a harsh grating as of 1,000 thunders. The fiery walls rushed back, and an outstretched arm caught my own as I fell, fainting into the abyss. It was that of General Sal. The French army had entered Toledo. The Inquisition was in the hands of its enemies. And with that, we come to the end of our story, where our narrator is saved at the very last minute. It's a bit of a Deus Ex Machina kind of ending that kind of comes out of nowhere, but we can discuss that in a bit. I don't want to get ahead of myself too much, but because of some of this, some of you might think this is a bit tame, because you're probably thinking about like shotgun collars and reverse bear traps. But I think it's important to remember the time period that it was written, and really the only difference here between this and some of Jigsaw's death traps is really just the gratuitousness of the gratuitousness of the deaths. We're kind of spared those gory details. But let's move on a little bit and talk about its initial release of the story and some of its adaptations. The Pit and the Pendulum was originally released in 1843 in a compilation of other stories called The Gift, a Christmas and New Year's present, which is kind of funny to me. Could you imagine some granny in the 1800s picking up this book for their grandkids, thinking it's full of wholesome romances and stories of valor, and then nestled within the pages is this story of some unnamed person being sentenced to death and tortured, um, as it describes everything in painstaking detail. That's like buying the movie Sausage Party or, I don't know, South Park for a kid just because on the surface it looks like a kid's animated movie. I'm not sure that's how things really went upon release, but something like that definitely would have happened in the 90s. Um, like when I asked for the movie A Bug's Life, that Pixar movie, and I got ants instead, the termite war scene definitely didn't scare me as a kid. Nope. Feel free to comment your own childhood accidental traumas. Now, something like The Pit and the Pendulum in the modern day would seem fairly tame in comparison to a lot of horror that's available. But during its time period, I can imagine that many of its readers would have been shocked and horrified at its depiction of torture. This type of horror was, far from mainstream, and modern horror really wasn't a staple yet. Mary Shelley had only written Frankenstein, maybe 20 years or so, prior to the release of The Pit and the Pendulum. And when you compare the two works, they vary wildly in tone. Frankenstein is dark and brooding, but the characters are there and they're fleshed out, and it delivers a pretty poignant message. The Pit and the Pendulum on the surface is just some dude getting condemned to death in their torture. We never figure out why they were condemned or even, what they think about the validity of their sentencing. It's just them reliving the moment. At least on the surface level, there's no obvious point or message. Now, Poe received a lot of criticism in his time for, his work and its dark themes, and a lot of that probably comes from his own harsh criticism of other authors, so there's probably a little quid pro quo going on there, but one of his critics described The Pit and the Pendulum as, "It does not seem to have any permanent literary value." This is just from Wikipedia, by the way. It's a little hard to find critical response of The Pit and the Pendulum from its time period, but I can imagine it went the same way as a lot of his other stories kind of went. But boy, was this guy wrong. Poe in general inspired many of your favorite authors like H.P. Lovecraft, Sir Arthur Conan Doyle, and Stephen King. The Pit and the Pendulum is no different from his other works, as it has quite a few international film adaptations, including one starring Vincent Price, who is, in a lot of horror films from back in the day, mostly as a villain. Personally, I recognize Vincent Price most for his role in the 1986 animated film The Great Mouse Detective, as Professor Ratigan, which is absolutely a great movie and still holds up, and the soundtrack still lives rent free in my head. Goodbye so soon, and isn't this a crime? I guess I should also mention the movie The Raven, starring John Cusack, that depicts the pendulum scene where the antagonist of the movie binds one of Edgar Allan Poe's most staunch critics, Rufus Griswold, to a board and lets the pendulum just cut him in half. I haven't actually seen the movie, but it looks all right. It's more of a mystery thriller than a horror movie, but that's still cool. It's really funny to me, though, that the movie decides to cut Griswold in half because in the real world, he had the audacity to write Poe's obituary, where he criticized the man even in death. There are also several other homages to the pendulum in other media, like the Flintstones and MacGyver, where they are subject to a pendulum-inspired trap. Now, before someone goes into the comments with an actually style comment that this may have been influenced by the torture methods of the Spanish Inquisition instead of Poe's story, this method of torture was never actually used by the Inquisition. It's very much an Iron Maiden style sort of historical confusion. The Iron Maiden, that box with the spikes in it that, has, Mother Mary on it or whatever, where they close it and it kills you. That wasn't really a form of torture or, death sentence. There's only one paragraph in one book that recounts this style of torture, and it's generally believed they confused it with another method of torture that doesn't include a bladed pendulum at all. This may have been Poe's particular inspiration, but the pit and the pendulum itself went on to garner way more attention than this account of the Spanish Inquisition and its torture. So I'd argue that the pit and the pendulum is far more influential to those depictions of the pendulum torture trap. So I'm going to stop myself from continuing down this rabbit hole, though. One last homage to the pit and the pendulum that I want to include is the song titled The Poet and the Pendulum, by the symphonic metal band Nightwish on their album Dark Passion Play. The content of the song doesn't really seem to have anything to do with the pit and the pendulum, but if you like operatic or symphonic metal, then I can definitely recommend it. It's absolutely a banger. Also, just for the sake of making a Warhammer 40k reference, but I'm pretty sure Corvus Corax and the Raven Guard are pretty much a homage to Edgar Allan Poe, not specifically to the Pit and Pendulum, but I'm pretty sure Corvus Corax, their Primarch, actually used the phrase Nevermore in one of the books, if I'm not mistaken. If he did, someone is going to go into the comments and let me know really quickly. I know this because I haphazardly made a 40k comment in my last video and was quickly corrected on the specifics of all the details involving what I was trying to reference. So, as you do, my excuse is I paint orcs, so my knowledge of 40k starts and ends with the red ones go faster. Anyways, it's time to do a little analysis of the Pit and the Pendulum and see if there may be any greater meaning to the story. I really like ARGs, or alternate reality games, because you have to put in some work to actually figure out what is going on. If you want a sneak peek what goes into that kind of thing, you should definitely check out my video on Local 58. But, beware, it's an hour and a half long if you haven't already seen it. But that just goes to show you how many things can be found that are not simply told to you in a straightforward kind of way. The same can be done with a lot of Poe's work, as it contains a lot of symbolism and illusion. It might not be quite as cryptic as something like Local 58, House of Leaves, or Dark Souls, but there is plenty of room to make your own assumptions of what the story or point is. It's not ergodic literature per se, but it's still fun to ponder on its meaning. And again, I would like to point out once again that I have no credentials in classic literature, so I'm sure there's going to be some common observations that I'm probably going to miss, but I don't intend to let that stop me. So, what secrets lie beneath this veneer of torture and misery? Let's find out. The very first thing that I would like to point out is that the fate of our narrator is spoiled within the very first paragraph. As they are describing the white thin lips of the Inquisitors, he likens it to the whiteness of the paper they are writing their story on. So we know from the very beginning that they lived through this ordeal. Now, upon my first read through the story, I didn't really catch that. I just kind of glazed over it without realizing it. But if you're a more attentive reader than myself, something like this could kind of take the tension out of everything. It's kind of like watching a prequel. You know something is going to happen, but you kind of already know how it ends. I think this might just be a concession for its time, as maybe reading about someone being tortured to death might not have gone over well back then. But if they knew they lived, they'd probably be more apt to enjoy it or at least finish the story. Baby steps, if you will, because now we have stuff like, the human centipede. So maybe we should have taken smaller baby steps. Insert obligatory Alderi 40K reference here. Either way, it does take the stakes of the story down massively. But like I said, I just skimmed completely over that on my first read through, and it didn't really hamper my experience. But I can imagine it would have had I noticed it. Another thing to point out about our narrator is that they are not gendered throughout the entire story. So anybody could place themselves into the shoe of our torture victim. Even you, dear reader, can experience hopelessness and fear. Very cool. The very first paragraph of our story includes imagery of seven candles, which gives us our first good clue for the inspirations of our story. And there are plenty of other things later on that back this up. But these 7 candles are most likely a reference to Revelation 1:20. The mystery of the 7 stars which thou sawest in my right hand, and the 7 golden candlesticks. The 7 stars are the angels of the 7 churches, and the 7 candlesticks which thou sawest are the 7 churches. So the book of Revelations is a book of apocalyptic prophecy, and deciphering it is not something I'm really up to, because there are people who spend their entire lives trying to decipher all its meaning and never finish. But I think the correlation is fairly clear, because Poe likens the 7 candles to the 7 angels later on, and at the end of the paragraph it says, their flames went out utterly, the blackness of darkness supervened, all sensations appeared swallowed up in a mad rushing descent as of the soul into Hades. So it seems fairly cut and dry to me that there is a religious or spiritual undertone to this story. Not to mention that this sentencing is being carried out by the Inquisition, a branch of the Catholic Church. And speaking of the Inquisition, I guess now is a better time than any to go ahead and get this rabbit hole out of the way. All right, so the popular idea of the Spanish Inquisition is that it was a group of corrupt, zealotous torturers and murderers who spared few that came into their inquisitorial gaze. Turns out it may be over-exaggerated. And before I go any further, I'm going to keep this as brief as possible. Did the Inquisition torture people? Yes. Did they condemn people to death? Also, yes. Is that bad? Absolutely. Are the accounts of torture, legal proceedings, and overall numbers of victims who were condemned to death or torture accurate? Nope. So, with everything, there's always 3 sides to a story. And in this case, it's Catholic Spain, Protestant Europe, and the truth. During the 15th through 17th centuries, Spain was one of the most powerful countries in the world, with an empire that spanned the globe, including, New Spain, which is, modern-day Mexico. You could say that some of these other European countries were jealous. Martin Luther in the 16th century, nailed his 95 Thesis to the church door, starting the Protestant Reformation, creating this divide in Christianity. This, of course, led to lots of conflicts, and propaganda for either side. The propaganda spurred on by the Protestant parts of Europe became known as the Spanish Black Legend, as it was coined, hundreds of years later, and it painted Spain as pretty much evil conquerors, and gave them ludicrous numbers of torture and execution at the hands of the Spanish Inquisition, in the hundreds of thousands, maybe even to millions. Modern estimates are that around 150,000 people were put on trial, and about 3 to 5,000 of those people actually being executed, and this is over the course of 350 years. Is that bad? Yeah. But when you compare it to what the courts of the time were doing, not the Inquisition, in that context, it's not nearly as bad. And this includes the other countries of Europe, not just Spain. Apparently, people even tried performing like fake heresy so that they could get the Inquisition to try them instead of the regular courts, because they were more likely to, be spared and given forgiveness. My entire adult life kind of just thought of, the Spanish Inquisition as these, zealotous group of sadistic torturers, and turns out they weren't half as bad as I thought. I'm gonna stop here with the rabbit hole, though, because this could just go on and on. But I highly recommend, if this is something that's interesting, you can go and look at this information yourself. But let's just go ahead and get back to the pit and the pendulum. All right, so the Inquisition may not have been as bad as we thought, but that doesn't mean that Poe had access to this type of information. Likelihood is that he heard all the horror stories of the Spanish Black Legend, but Poe seems to use it more as a backdrop for the story to give some quasi historical context, but he doesn't really seem to make any grand statements on the Inquisition. The narrator also makes no moral comments on the Inquisition, other than their torture. They don't condemn it or even talk about why, what they did to bring them there. It does reinforce this spiritual backdrop to the story, however. Back to before the rabbit hole, I mentioned a line from the story that goes, "The soul's descent into Hades." So Hades is both the god of the dead in Greek myth, and it's kind of synonymous with the place where the dead would go. And in Christianity, it's likened to a kind of purgatory place where the dead go. Either way, in both instances, it's a place where the dead goes. So Poe likens this story as a person being plunged into purgatory, and in this place they face different trials. The first being the darkness and avoiding the pit, which they avoid solely by accident. They do, however, try to be tactical and aware of their situation by measuring the walls in complete darkness by using a marker. I would call this clever. They continue to be clever by using the rat's appetite to escape the pendulum later on. Speaking of the pendulum, there are some interesting bits of symbolism here as well. The pendulum appears to be wielded by a depiction of Father Time, and the pendulum is like that of a clock. We don't see these types of clocks anymore, besides like antique shops and maybe your grandparents' house. But a lot of grandfather clocks used a pendulum designed to keep time, kind of like a metronome. So there's an obvious allusion to the passage of time, but the distinction is that the pendulum has a blade that will kill our narrator once it reaches the bottom. So to me, this represents the unyielding passage of time during a person's life until they reach the end where, death comes for us all. Here, though, our narrator seems to escape death at the very last moment. But they only escape from death by pendulum to the purgatory of their cell, where they eventually are forced by the closing of the fiery walls towards the pit. The Ultima Thule, as the story calls it, or as I read it, the final death. In Christianity, there are some distinctions about death. There are the death of faithful believers and those of the unbelievers. But in Revelations, there is a prophecy regarding the return of Christ, where after the rapture, we will be revived and refreshed in a new body, and then go before God for judgment, where the unbelievers are then sent to their final death, separated from the presence of God, to Sheol or Gehenna, or as most know it as hell. Also, theologically speaking, there are differences between those things. So our narrator has escaped falling into this pit of darkness by accident, and then they escape the pendulum through wits and cunning, but eventually they're confronted with the closing of the walls, and there is nothing left that they can do to save themselves. That is until the trumpet sound and General Sal comes barging in at the last moment to save them from the pit. The inclusion of the trumpets kind of brings the Revelation story back around in this story, as the trumpets are the heralds of the apocalypse in the book of Revelations. General Sal is also a real person, but they were never in Toledo, where our story takes place. So historical accuracy was not that important to Poe, it seems. So, what does this all mean? In my own opinion, I think saying we have to make a concerted effort in life because death is coming for each of us, and we have to use our own cunning and wits to forge our path instead of just laying down and waiting for death. We can't expect God to do all the work. We have free will and the ability to make a choice, but we can expect God to be there in the end to rescue us from the final death. To me, that seems like a good and fitting analysis for the time period. Maybe. I could be way off, but I like it. As far as my personal feelings after reading the story, let's see. Life is hard, and there are several trials and tribulations to overcome. Sometimes things are completely unfair, and we can succumb to fear, despair, and madness, but we have to try and use our wits and will to overcome these. Sometimes, though, there are things we just can't overcome on our own. The only thing that can keep us from falling into a pit of despair and misery as the walls of life close in on us is the love of a friend. Sometimes we need our own General Asal to come in and lend a helping hand. I know that's a little sappy, but just what I thought. So those are my thoughts, but what are yours? Like I said before, I have no qualifications to accurately define what the story is actually saying, but I don't think you have to. If you had to have credentials to interpret meaning for every story, then what is the point of the story? Sometimes it's the best stories that transcend these walls to inspire the everyman, and inspiration has no qualifications but the ones you set for yourself. So please feel free to comment your own interpretations of the story. I'm sure several of you have thoughts and probably criticisms of my own interpretation, and that's absolutely a fine thing to have. But I'm, glad to have shared this story. As a kid, I was absolutely obsessed with Poe. I remember my mom, God bless her, used to give me books as often as she was able. And when I was young, it started out with books like Hank the Cowdog and the Boxcar Children. But then it became like the Hardy Boys, Nancy Drew, Goosebumps. And then I got a small collection of Edgar Allan Poe short stories that included The Cask of Amontillado and The Telltale Heart. And I was just enamored with it. And it's really odd that I actually, became obsessed with it, because at the time I really couldn't understand all the themes, but just something about the premise of these stories just stuck with me for all these years. Now, for all of you who have made it this far in the video, I have words for you. Thank you. The reception to my last video was overwhelming and very encouraging, and I'm absolutely humbled to have so many watch it and write so many nice and encouraging comments. I started this channel as a sort of kind of catharsis for myself, because I find fewer and fewer opportunities to now to talk about my ideas and concepts with friends, about stuff like this. So, sometimes the responsibility of life just takes precedence, and it's hard to stay in touch with the things that you're interested in or passionate about. So when I started doing this, I really had this idea of I was just kind of like screaming into the abyss, but then the abyss screamed back. And I'm absolutely floored by it. From the bottom of my heart, thank you so much. And I hope you stick around for what comes next. Also, some people brought up a lot of interesting things that I just assumed my whole life, like the hysteria of the Orson Welles radio drama being kind of an urban legend and over-exaggerated, and, people were talking about the specific history of the black paintings by Francisco Goya. Like, these comments are absolutely amazing, and I adore that people just came in to share this kind of stuff with everybody in the comments and with me. It's amazing. Every day is an opportunity to learn something new and expand your views and perceptions, which is awesome. A few of you also noticed a few peculiar inclusions as well, and I won't expand on any of it because, you know, what's the fun in that? But yeah, it's there, and it will continue to be there. I wonder what's going to be in this video possibly, because some stories, you know, they take time and a concerted effort, and their story and consequences deserve to be known. If you're new here, I would like to say welcome in. Here we look at the macabre, mystery, fact and fiction, and everything in between. Really just things that I find interesting. So if that does interest you, please feel to subscribe and follow along. But that's all for me. Ciao for now.